Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Sapient Thoughts. Our discussion today is to ask the question, is there a correlation between affluence and atheism? Interesting question. The Quran, in fact, it does reveal an exposition about a particular people who felt a sense of disinclination towards faith, even denial, even opposition to faith, based upon feelings of affluence and feelings of self-security and self-safety and newfound opulence in their lives. For example, chapter 34, verse 34 reveals, and Allah says in the Quran in that chapter, translated meaning of which is, that never has Allah sent a warner to a people except there existed amongst those people a group who were corrupted by wealth and said that we don't believe in that message of yours. We have more wealth and children than you, and we will not be punished. And that's an interesting, in fact, pathology of people. What they exhibit, in fact, is a feeling of hubris, a feeling of self-autonomy, a feeling of self-grandiosity and feelings of entitlement, that we have all of these things, why would we then be punished? Nigel Barber, in fact, in his research on asking the same question about whether there is a correlation between affluence and atheism, he says, well, there is, in fact, because in his observation, in his analysis, he said, generally speaking, you would find people who are simply more cognizant and acknowledge more their own human weaknesses and frailties and fragilities and vulnerabilities and temporalities, feel the need to believe in a supreme being that they would turn to and pray to and call to and seek assistance from, meaning they're more in tune with their natural state because they're realizing everything, in fact, is simply in flux. Together with them, everything is in social flux. Whereas those who might live in social democracies where there are more agencies and more institutions that cater for people's needs might feel less the need to believe in a God because they feel simply more in control. Interesting, in fact, watershed moment, historically speaking, here in the UK and Britain, was in fact the 1960s, years that sociologists call and they dub the years of the sexual or cultural revolution. So what changed in these years? Well, number one, they were post-war decades, so newfound freedoms for people. This, of course, was, there was a baggage of conflict and suffering in the past, and now there was a rise in wages, a rise in mobilities, a rise in social spaces for people who were now different. They could navigate different places and different spaces in their lives. Now, this on the one hand did have some positives because it meant that people could spend more time with their families and so on and so forth. But for the church, it was a trouble because it meant a disinclination to spend time that they would usually spend in the church, and they would spend it elsewhere. But the point is not just the fact that social spaces are increasing, cultural attitudes are also shifting. And that was a major change. So there was a rise of a new urban milieu from the 1960s, right? And so therefore more now tendencies of adapting and adjusting and changing sexual moralities, new discussions on homosexuality, new discussions on feminism, but also on atheism. And that is a point that Janet Eccles in her research makes. The point she makes is that in 1967 you had the founding of the BHA, the British Humanist Association, where people felt more readily inclined towards adopting atheistic tendencies. Now in the Quran we have an interesting discussion because in chapter 18 of the Quran, Allah reveals for us a narrative concerning two men. Now one of those men, Allah says he had two gardens. It's a simple point, but if you think carefully, he had two gardens, Allah says. Allah bestowed the gardens upon him. But he felt so entitled with his privileges, it made him strut in his sense of self-arrogance and self-grandiosity. And so he came out to his next door neighbor, his companion, his friend, and he says, check it out. I have more wealth than you, and I have a greater following than you. And Allah says that he entered his وَكَانَ لَهُ ثَمَرٌ. He had fruits, which the scholars say they symbolize wealth and gold and these kind of things. And Allah says he enters his garden وَهُوَ ظَالِمْ لِنَفْسِهِ, and he was a wrongdoer or unjust into his own very self. Now, of course, on the one hand, the greater meaning is that he was denying God because he thought all of these things are his own making without understanding this being bestowed on him by a supreme divine being, the creator of all. That's a tragedy in himself, but also the idea that he was, not alert to his own sense of vulnerabilities and weaknesses and the fact that nothing lasts forever. But he couldn't see that for the moment. And so he says to his friend, I don't even think the last hour is going to come in. I don't even think I'm going to lose any of this. And he says that, and even if it did come and I end up getting to the next life, I think what I would have there would far outstrip what I have here in terms of splendor and beauty and goodness. And his friend says, listen, you have all of these things, but why don't you simply say, MashaAllah, la quwwata illa billah, this is from the grace of Allah, there's no power except with Allah. Why don't you attribute all of your goodness to God? That makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. And he says it could be that your fortune changes. Remember that life is in flux. Nothing ever changes the same. And so nothing stays the same. And so he says to him that you could lose it because what if the heavy storm comes and ruins all of your crops and your fruits and your trees? Then what would happen? And that's exactly, in fact, what happened. And therefore, it's a reflection for us to think deeply about the things that we have. Number one, don't remain forever. Number two, everything that we do have has been gifted to us from God. It should never be a cause or reason for us to deny God. I mean, on the complete contrary, it should be a reason for us to thank God for His blessings unto us. And this should be, in fact, a reason for us to be more in tune with our sense of gratitude towards God. In the Quran, Allah has a beautiful example in the Prophet Sulaiman, the Prophet Solomon. Amazing, he was a king prophet, and he had so much splendor and so many things. But the prayer he makes is very profound and key here. It's not about self-entitlement, I have something and just check it out. No, that's arrogance, that's hubris, that's gluttony. He doesn't say that. He says, هَذَا مِنْ فَضْلِ رَبِّي لِيَبْلُوَنِي أَشْكُرْ أَمْ أَكْفُرْ. He says, this is a grace from my Lord to check me and test me. Would I be grateful or would I be an ingrate? Would I be ungrateful? If you want to learn more about this topic of the correlation between affluence and atheism, read my article on sapiensinstitute.org with the same title, Is a Correlation Between Affluence and Atheism. Jazakumullah.